you wonder how Zelenskyy finds time to host and entertain and show around this high-speed rota of international VIPs and leaders who come to court him and remarkably pass in and out of Kyiv in the middle of a war, quite untroubled by Russian aggression. But yes, Janet Yellen is the emblem of the US revenue, the US tax system, and therefore the economic commitment of the Biden administration to continue financing this war. As she puts it, we're here for as long as it takes.
Yes. And, you know, from what we can now gather, it looks like Russia is there for as long as it takes as well. The US and many others have made it very clear what side they've chosen, but China too has picked sides, it would seem, diplomatically at this point.
Well, China's position was deliberately ambiguous for a very long time and probably still is a little ambiguous. On the one hand, it was refusing to condemn Moscow's invasion of Kyiv, of Ukraine. But on the other hand, it was calling for restraint. It's now put up a peace proposal that it had been mooting for some months. Yet at the same time, it's emerged as by far the single greatest buyer of Russian oil and gas, which is directly transferring revenues into Putin's treasury and financing his war effort. But now, just in this last week, Bev, it does seem as if China is increasingly engaging on the Russian account, coming in to support the Russian war. We saw Xi Jinping's foreign minister, Wang Yi, visiting Moscow just a few days ago and affirming continuing Chinese support and increase. In fact, he said that we, China, will increase our strategic cooperation and support of Russia, which is a clear indication publicly, very publicly, in Moscow of China's commitment to supporting Russia. But then, of course, we have two more developments. We have the news from Moscow that Xi Jinping, the president himself of China, will visit Moscow next week, the Russians have said. So the public diplomatic support is an increase. Visiting Moscow is an increase in the palpable, visible diplomatic, political support for Putin's war. If there were to be any lethal weapons deliveries, that would take it to a completely new level, and China would have to shed any fig leaf of neutrality. Yeah.
I want to talk about the arms in a moment, but what do you think China's play is here? We'd expect them to support Russia given the communist history, but how does it think it's positioning itself in a global geopolitical sense?
Well, as you'd remember, a couple of weeks before Putin invaded Ukraine, Putin was in Beijing and signed the so-called No Limits Pact with Xi Jinping. They're not exactly firm allies, but they do share an overlapping set of international equities, and primary among those is opposing the US, opposing the West, opposing the international order as it stands, with the intention of replacing the international order with an autocratic, friendly order, one that suits the interests of China and Russia. And I think what we see now from China, this increasing inching towards more open support for Russia, is that China has decided that its future lies more firmly than ever with supporting Putin and Russia, and perhaps even some anxiety that Russia, because it's suffering so much, and quite obviously the momentum is with Ukraine and against Russia in this war, perhaps the Chinese are actually starting to get anxious that Moscow could be in trouble, that Putin's regime could be in trouble, and that it requires more support from China. Remember, China has an intimate need of Russia because, apart from anything else, Russia is a huge buffer state on its western flank, separating it from Europe, just as it has North Korea, another supposed ally, as a buffer state on its eastern flank.
Yeah, so it needs that kind of protection, but it also wants a stable Russia, as you point out, as such a close neighbour.
Yes, I mean, at the moment they've got a Russia that's gone rogue with this invasion and in effect taking on all of NATO, although indirectly. But it's also got a potentially destabilized Russia. And anything worse than a rogue Russia for China would be a collapsing Russia or a chaotic Russia or a breakdown in civil order, which would make China's western flank more vulnerable. That would be something of a nightmare for Xi Jinping. So I think that could explain the increased level of demonstrable support from China to Russia.
Yeah. So let's go back to the arms, because this becomes problematic for ending this war anytime soon. If China starts militarily supporting Russia, that boosts them, that gives them greater capacity at a time when really others are trying to end this war. What does this Ukraine war become in the end?
Well, if the Ukraine war is a war of attrition, if it's a simple matter of one side grinding its forces out against the other to see which side can last longer, then direct Chinese intervention would enormously bolster Russia's capability. Remember, even before this war, China's economy was 10 times the size of Russia's. Now it would be more so because of Russia's shrinkage. China has all its manufacturing prowess available to it, and it's just a very capable, very wealthy and very well-supplied regime that could, if it chose to, give enormous support to Russia for as long as Russia needed. Now, that, of course, would increase the pressure on Ukraine and, in turn, increase the pressure on the NATO alliance to support Ukraine. So it could seriously escalate and intensify the Russia-Ukraine war.
And does it become almost the proxy of the new old Cold War?
You know, that's what we're edging towards, Bev. I mean, there's quite a bit of talk already that the Ukraine-Russia war is a proxy war, but only one team has the proxy, right? Russia has no proxy. Russia is itself fighting for itself, whereas NATO has Ukraine as its proxy. But if the Chinese were to come into the picture on Russia's side, then suddenly you have a real proxy war with China supporting one side, the US and NATO the other, with two proxies fighting, Russia and Ukraine. And that could well, if this is in fact the way it's evolving, could well become the first true proxy war of the new Cold War between the US and China.
Disturbing thought. Great to talk as always, Peter. Thanks so much.
Never very cheerful these days, but happy to be here. Thank you.
You have to forewarn us. It's your job. Good to have you on.